So hello and welcome to another episode of Biographics. I'm your interim host Karl Smallwood, and today we're talking about Charles II, the Merry Monarch. And since we're talking about that oh-so-British thing of a member of royalty, I have a lovely cup of tea. That was very hot and burned my tongue. And I should mention that, like all our videos, this one is based on an original script submitted by a member of our stable of writers, this one being Larry Holsworth. You can follow them on their social media links if they provided them, below alongside my own. But let's get to it. On May 6, 2023, Charles III's coronation ceremony was held in London. I didn't watch it. I was asleep. Following this celebration of his ascension to the throne, which actually occurred upon the death of Elizabeth II the preceding September, the king prominently displayed two objects from the crown jewels. The sovereign orb, which represents the power of the monarch and its status as a gift of God, and the sovereign scepter, which represents his worldly authority, both of which were important symbols in the role of the monarch. And yeah, just the fact that our king has to wear like £1 million hat and carry the holy hand grenade from Worms and a big gold stick is endlessly hilarious to me. Both the orb and the scepter had originally been made for the coronation of King Charles II in 1661. Charles II returned a monarch to Britain after the period known in British history as the Interregnum. Oliver Cromwell had ruled Britain as an alleged republic, though in truth it had been a dictatorship marked with religious intolerance and persecution. Like, he literally banned Christmas, football and drinking. Three things that I hope everyone knows are very important to British culture. So Charles II's father, oddly named Charles I, had been convicted of treason, like big air quotes there, and beheaded for his many crimes. His followers, commonly called the Cavaliers, had endured persecution at home, and many fled to Europe or North America in exile. And that's where we get the King Charles Spaniel, the long hair of the Cavaliers. I like that. I like that we've just got a dog named after him. Member of our royal family. The new crown jewels were necessary in 1661 because Cromwell's followers had melted down the crown and ornaments worn by previous monarchs, certain that such objects would never be needed again. The restoration of the monarchy proved otherwise, and though the royal house has changed since the return of the Stuarts, the throne has remained. The orb and the scepter have been displayed by every British monarch since Charles II held them at the culmination of a youth which had been harrowing at best. His reign and his impact on Britain, and thus the world, remains extensive. Here is just a small part of his story, starting, of course, at the beginning. So Charles II was born on May 29, 1630 in St James's Palace in the city of Westminster, London. His father was, of course, Charles I, and his mother was Henrietta Maria, the sister of King Louis XIII of France. Henrietta was a Catholic, as was her mother, Marie de Medici, and Catholicism was at the time held in deep suspicion by British Protestants for its perceived loyalty to the Pope, but also for its connections to the courts of France and Spain. And if you know anything about Britain, it's that we just don't like our neighbours. Even other neighbours within Britain. Even other neighbours who live in the same town if they happen to be on the other side of it. I went to a high school and there was another high school less than a mile away, and every day there'd be fist fights between the members of those high schools because they went to the other high school. We're a very contentious people is what I'm saying. So moving on. The connection between Charles II and France were not merely religious though. One French king was his uncle, subsequent French kings were cousins, and Charles, like most European royals, could count relatives among the courts throughout continental Europe. So young Charles was but 12 years of age when religious and political disputes in Britain devolved into what was known as the First English Civil War in 1642. Britain split into two factions deemed the Royalists, who unsurprisingly supported the Royals and were known as the Cavaliers, and the Parliamentarians, known as the Roundheads for the shape of their helmets worn by their troops, and not, as some say, like the really bad haircuts they had. And I say this with a bad haircut. I will get it cut soon, but I've been busy recording these videos. The Roundheads claimed to be the true Britons, while the Cavaliers were derided as traitors to Britain, mere servants of the Catholic monarchs in Spain and France, and ultimately the Pope. By 1646, the declining military situation of the Royalists dictated that Charles, who had until then served with his father's troops, flee to safety. He found sanctuary in France, where he lived under the protection of his cousin, Louis XIV, then all of 8 years of age. His father, Charles I, surrendered to the Scottish Presbyterian army that supported Cromwell in May 1646. The following January, the king was handed over to Parliament and held under house arrest. But he had a big house, so it was okay. He later escaped, fled to the Isle of Wight, and was again held in custody at Carisbrooke Castle in 1647. From there, he negotiated an alliance with Scottish leaders who promised to invade England on his behalf. Charles I agreed to the terms, which included the establishment of Presbyterianism as the state religion of England once the Scots prevailed in their invasion. During the ensuing war, the Second English Civil War, the English army prevailed over the Scots adversaries. Following the conflict, Charles I attempted to continue to negotiate with all parties, but Cromwell, by then, had decided to establish a military government with himself as its head. Charles I was placed in custody of Cromwell's army to be tried for treason. During this period, his son, the future Charles II, remained in Europe, attempting to negotiate support for his father's cause. He lived with no income, other than that from the charity of relatives and supporters, which, as mentioned, were kings and other royals, so he was doing okay. He failed to gain much support on the continent, financial or military, and he was forced to watch helplessly from exile as events in England unfolded. On January 30th, 1649, Charles I was beheaded in London. The following day, they took his head, reattached it to his body, embalmed it, and then interred it at Windsor Castle. The act of regicide drew, shall we say, harsh reactions from royalists, or would you believe it? In Europe and in Scotland, the Covenanter Parliament named Charles II, then at The Hague, King of Scotland, England and Ireland. They then banned the king from entering his new dominions until he agreed to establish Presbyterianism as the state religion in all three. Charles II at first envisioned the idea of entering his dominions with an army, invading Scotland and removing the Parliament. He had Lord Montrose take a small army to the Orkney Islands, where he was to threaten Scotland with an invasion as means of strengthening his negotiating position with Scottish leaders. Montrose decided to heroically ignore this and invade Scotland instead. He was defeated and executed for his troubles. Always listen to the guy with the best hair. At that point, Charles II agreed to Scottish terms, including Presbyterian government in all of his domains, and entered Scotland in June 1650. His agreement made him popular in Scotland, but less so in England. It also led to another war, the Anglo-Scottish War of 1650 to 1652. There was all else to do. In that war, which the primary English army, called the New Model Army, was again led by Oliver Cromwell, fate did not smile on Charles and his supporters. Military defeats led him to flee, causing one of the better-known adventures of his life. Charles fled from the decisive royalist defeat at the Battle of Worcester. Even I, someone who lives here, mispronounce British town and city names sometimes. For any Americans out there who would like a challenge, hopefully the editor can figure this out if we leave this in, but here's the city of Bicester. Yes, it is pronounced that way, despite being spelled like that. Charles fled from the decisive royalist defeat at the Battle of Worcester on September 3rd, 1651, accompanied by a small party of supporters. As he fled, Cromwell announced a bounty for information as to Charles's whereabouts, as well as threats of arrest and execution for anyone who aided the future king. During his flight, he stayed in the houses and inns of royalist supporters, many of them Catholics. Several times he was forced to depart rapidly, literally sometimes just ahead of Cromwell's men searching for him. He initially attempted to reach perceived safety among supporters in London. He reached the White Ladies Priory late on September 4th. The following day, his party attempted and failed to cross the River Severn. Returning to the Priory, he was forced to leave and hide in a nearby wood, hiding in, of all things, the branches of a nearby oak tree. And while it sounds like, just a fun story you'd maybe tell kids, like Charles II was very fond of his time in the tree, as we're about to get to. So Charles spent a full day hiding in this tree, which became known to posterity as the Royal Oak. He later enjoyed retelling this story of his stay in the oak tree, and the story became part of the celebrations of the Royal Oak Day in Britain. He loved it. He stayed in a tree. Following his stay in the White Ladies Priory and other safe houses and a tree, Charles eventually made it safely to Shoreham before sailing to France, arriving there on October 16th, 1651. During the course of his escape, he disguised himself as a farmer, cropped his formerly long hair, adopted the language and accents expected of a commoner. He also adopted the habit of appearing stooped in an attempt to mask his considerably taller than average height for the time. He also endured several close calls and he was nonetheless recognised. He was royalty, frequently escaping Roundhead soldiers by mere moments. Numerous supporters he made contact with along the way paid for their failures to report him with their very lives. And this is just I might not have a chance to tell this story on this channel, so presumably there's been a biographics about the Queen, like Queen Elizabeth II, she's called the Queen here. She took to wearing very bright, loud, single colour pastel dresses and a matching hat later in her life. It became just a symbol of her. And the reason she did that is because she wanted to be picked out in crowds, because she knew that people would queue up for hours and days to see her. So she thought, well, if I wear the biggest, most garish hats and dress combo possible, people will pick me out of a crowd. And when she was asked, do people really struggle to pick you out of a crowd, Your Majesty? You are the Queen. You're literally on our money. She responded about it happens more than you'd think. And she told the story of when she was walking around the place she owns in Scotland, or she did before she died. And she was out for a walk and met some American tourists. And they were talking to the Queen, being quite polite, saying, "Oh, so I understand the Queen lives around here?" It's like, yeah, I've heard that too. It's like, "Have you ever met her?" And the Queen thought for a moment and responded, "No, but he has," and motioned to her bodyguard. And the American tourist took a photo with her bodyguard, which she took. She held the camera and took the photo because they wanted to take a picture with someone who'd been near the Queen. And I just love that story. Like the Queen was so adorable. Oh. Charles arrived in Paris in late 1651 and took up residence in a luxurious palace at Saint-Germain, paid for with an allowance granted to him by his cousin. There he entered into numerous palace intrigues as well as attempts to gain support against the government established by Oliver Cromwell in England. Despite familial and religious connections in France and the Low Countries, Charles was largely unable to generate support for his restoration to the throne. His situation worsened when both France and the Dutch Republic entered into military alliances with Cromwell's government. France's alliance with England made his presence less than welcome, to put it diplomatically, and Cromwell's agents pressured the French to detain Charles and return him to England to cut his head off like they did with his dad. Charles turned to Spain, which included the southern Netherlands, as part of his empire. An alliance between Charles II, who styled himself as the King of Scotland, Ireland and England and Spain, took place in 1656 via the Treaty of Brussels. In 1658, Charles's small army of royalist supporters and Spanish troops fought at the Battle of Dunes against a joint Anglo-French army. Charles's troops were led by his brother, James. Until the failure at the Battle of the Dunes, Charles had planned to lead his troops in an invasion of England via Scotland. The loss of the Channel ports necessary to launch such an invasion, as well as the loss of men from the battle, put an end to those plans. He remained in exile while his enemy, Oliver Cromwell, died, and the government he had managed with an iron-handed efficiency began to crumble under the inept guidance of his successor, Richard Cromwell. In 1659, Richard resigned as Lord Protector, the de facto head of government, and across Britain, chaos and lawlessness reigned. The first general election in Britain in almost 2 decades took place in 1660 and led to a more balanced House of Commons, roughly equally divided between royalists and parliamentarians. Charles took advantage of this situation by issuing the Declaration of Breda on April 4, 1660, named for the city in the United Netherlands where Charles resided. The declaration promised a pardon for all crimes committed during the civil wars and interregnum, religious tolerance, protection of property rights, and the return of control of the army to the crown in return for the restoration of the monarchy. It's a pretty sweet deal, all things considered. In truth, Charles had been residing in Brussels, in the Spanish Netherlands, then still at war with England. Supporters in England had advised Charles to relocate to Breda as to appear to be no longer allied with one of England's enemies. Charles also had no intention of extending his pardon to those of the parliamentarians who had supported the regicide of his dad, for obvious reasons. As for religious tolerance, Charles had never really exhibited any dogmatism regarding any faith, and he remained largely indifferent to the issue, even during his reign. On May 2nd, 1660, Parliament passed the resolution defining the government as King, Lords and Commons. Charles moved to The Hague shortly thereafter, and from there returned to England on May 25th, 1660. He arrived in London on May 29th, thereafter celebrated as Oak Apple Day, or more aptly, the Royal Oak Day in Britain.
Well, wasn't that an interesting fact or anecdote about a famous person or persons? I'm just kidding, I know the video is about Charles II. We are at least vaguely organised behind the scenes here. For anyone out there who has seen me pop up in the occasional video and is wondering who I am, I'm Brad, I work with Karl, and before anyone in the comment section starts saying it, no, I do not live in his basement. I'm just popping in today to talk to you about the sponsor of today's video, NordVPN. Now I know that I'm probably going to sound like a broken record when I say this, but the internet is not the safest of places. All it takes is for one harmful website posing as something harmless or one wrong click, and someone somewhere out there will know exactly how much pizza you just ordered for you and your friends. And also email addresses and passwords and, other less important stuff. If your online safety matters to you, then you should look into our sponsor, NordVPN. VPN, for those of you who don't know, stands for Virtual Private Network, which is a fancy way of saying when I'm online, nobody can see who I am unless I want them to. A single NordVPN account can protect up to 6 different devices at once, so you can keep your entire household protected. Hiding your IP and online activity is a great way to stop people from getting to you, but what about you accidentally letting them in? Well, that's where NordVPN's threat protection comes in very handy. Threat protection acts like a barrier between your device and the internet. It can block trackers and malware, and it can also prevent you from visiting malicious websites. It will also scan files while you're downloading them to see if that file may be problematic. Unless it's a video of your uncle dancing at a wedding. I'm afraid it can't do anything about that. I'm very sorry. Check out NordVPN and get 4 months extra on a 2-year plan by going to nordvpn.com/bio. It's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. A big thank you to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the king. And Charles II. See what I did there? I complimented my friend. Let's go.
Despite the promises of the Declaration of Breda, one of the earliest acts of Parliament following Charles II's return to the throne was the Indemnity and Oblivion Act of 1660, which of course sounds perfectly reasonable and nothing could go wrong with that. Written by Edward Hyde, soon to be titled the Earl of Clarendon, the Act issued a general pardon of crimes committed during the civil wars and interregnum, though it exempted crimes such as murder, rape, other sexual assaults, piracy, and, of all things, witchcraft. We are talking about like 500 years ago here, remember. It also named specific individuals who would not be considered pardoned and thus liable for trial and yes, execution. After weeks of debate, 50 individuals were named in the Act as ineligible for pardon. Eventually, 9 of them, identified as regicides, were tried, convicted, and executed by hanging, which sounds bad, but we're not done yet, because they were taken down just before they died, and then drawn and quartered, which means having their stomach slit open, their guts pulled out, and having horse pull apart their limbs. There wasn't all else to do. The body of Oliver Cromwell, on the other hand, was exhumed and then beheaded to see how he liked it. Richard Cromwell fled to France, leaving behind a wife he never saw again. The remainder of those named in the Indemnity and Oblivion Act were deprived of liberty, as it said so in there, by imprisonment or deportation, their properties confiscated. The lands formerly owned by the Crown were restored to the monarch, and other properties purchased or confiscated during the interregnum were left to the judgments of local courts and magistrates. The interregnum itself was stricken from all records of the monarchy, with the reign of Charles II recognised as having begun legally upon the death of his father, Charles I. Charles II's coronation took place in Westminster on April 23rd, 1661. The following year, His Majesty married in an arranged match with Catherine of Braganza, daughter of King John IV of Portugal. Catherine presented a dowry which included the city of Tangier in North Africa, 7 islands in Bombay, India. He also delivered some trading rights with the Portuguese colonies, as well as a considerable sum of cash. Just styling on all of us with a wedding gift like that. Like some islands, a city, a big pile of cash, and trading rights with Portugal. Charles and Catherine had no children during their marriage, though Catherine did suffer at least 4 known miscarriages. Yet Charles did not lack progeny. Over the course of his lifetime, he acknowledged no fewer than 13 illegitimate children, bestowing upon many of them titles of nobility, including earldoms and dukedoms. At least 2 of his mistresses were actresses of note, including Nell Gwyn and Moll Davis. His favourite mistress appears to have been Barbara Villiers, who bore him 5 children. It's worth noting that she was actually married at the time to a guy called Roger Palmer, who Charles decided to just give 2 Irish peerages to in compensation for his wife's, shall we say, services to the crown. Although Palmer never seated himself in Lords, he did accept both titles along with the obvious humiliation that accompanied them. Charles added to the shame by bestowing the titles as hereditary only to his own children with Barbara. Should Palmer have children by a subsequent marriage to another woman, the titles would not be bestowed. Because of his, what's the diplomatic way to put this? Bone spree. He's actually the ancestor of several prominent persons in more recent British history. For example, Prince William, the heir apparent to King Charles III, is a descendant of Charles II through his mother, Princess Diana. Ironically though, so is Queen Camilla and 4 prominent dukes in British nobility: the Duke of St Albans, the Duke of Grafton, the Duke of Buccleuch, and the Duke of Richmond. All have descended from dukedoms created by Charles II for his illegitimate offspring. And all I can think now is just the generic crazy person in front of a corkboard with wires everywhere of where does it lead? Why does it all lead back and just Charles II in the middle? Anyway, Charles was also a patron of the arts and a devotee of theatre and music. He enjoyed the hunts, horse racing, festivals, and other forms of entertainment. He also enjoyed being the centre of attention, regaling visitors to his court with tales of his adventures during his escapes from Cromwell and subsequent exile on the continent. Still, while some celebrated him as the Merry King, the guy brought back Christmas, football, and drinking for the majority of Britain. That's going to get you a lot of leeway with the majority of people. Others resented the extravagances of his courts and those of his offspring, paid for by taxes which fed the royal coffers. The Britain that Charles II reigned over as king underwent numerous changes and difficulties in the areas of religion, tolerance, wars, calamities, and epidemics. His courts, regardless of which royal palace he occupied, became a symbol of self-indulgence and, shall we say, moral laxity. The guy had 13 illegitimate children, which most Britons at the time didn't really care about because the same thing happened for them. And across Britain, there was a general easing of the puritanical attitudes present under Cromwell. For example, the theatres presented more bawdy plays, songs reflected less restrained lyrics, and poems and prose presented a more, and I hope I can pronounce this word correctly because they wrote it in the script and it's a fun word to say, licentiousness, which offended some sensibilities while delighting the less prudish. And as mentioned, drinking, football, Christmas, all those came back. You couldn't even go to church on Christmas Day under Cromwell. Like, what an idiot. The era marked the beginnings of the British global empire built on trade. Charles personally expanded the British East India Company in 5 separate royal charters. He granted the company the rights to raise its own army and navy, acquire territory, mint money, and create treaties of alliance in areas, making it a global power in its own right. He granted similar authority to the Hudson Bay Company in North America, giving the company control over all the lands drained by waters which eventually flowed into the Hudson Bay. The 1670 creation of the Hudson Bay Company led Charles to rename the area of what became Canada as Rupert's Land. They should still call it that. The name came from another of his cousins, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, who served as the company's and territory's first governor. In 1665, the Second Anglo-Dutch War began as English colonists and mercantile interests encroached on Dutch possessions in Africa, the Indies, and North America. It was during this that the English captured the Dutch colony in North America known as New Amsterdam. It was later renamed New York in honour of Charles's brother James, the Duke of York. Bet you didn't know that one, Americans. Dutch's victories included an attack on the River Thames when the Dutch ships destroyed a sizable amount of the British Navy. Charles responded by suing for peace. He publicly blamed the war on his once most trusted minister, Edward Hyde, the Earl of Clarendon, and charged him with treason. Clarendon, for his part, fled to France, where he remained in exile for the rest of his life. In 1668, Charles went to war with his cousin, Louis XIV of France, after allying England with Sweden and the Dutch. As for that war, it ended with a treaty agreed to in 1670, in which Louis agreed to an annual indemnity to be paid to Charles II's royal treasury, which had been severely depleted by Charles's military adventures. And, all the boozing and banging of mistresses. During all these military and mercantile activities, London was beset by 2 major disasters. The first came in the form of the Great Plague of London in the summer of 1665. At its height in the late summer, up to 7,000 people per day died of the plague, and mornings brought the call of "Bring out your dead" throughout the city.
Bring out your dead!
For anyone curious, Charles and his court took refuge from the horror of the plague in Salisbury, remaining out of the city until February 1666, when cold weather brought about a decrease in the death rate caused by the plague. As for the second disaster, that occurred on September 2nd, 1666, when a small fire began in the quaintly named Pudding Lane in one of the street's several bakeries. Hence the name. The preceding summer had been dry, and thatched roofs and timbered houses made up much of London proved eminently burnable. The Great Fire of London, as it came to be known, burned for 5 straight days, destroyed over 13,000 houses, 86 churches, including St. Paul's Cathedral, and rendered over 200,000 people homeless. Surprisingly, the death count was relatively low, though disputed. Modern historians consider the count at the time to have been inaccurate, given the overall destruction of the city. In his youth, the tutors of the future king did not consider the sciences as a suitable subject for a royal education. While in exile though, probably due to boredom, Charles acquainted himself with mathematics, anatomy, astronomy, botany and gardening, and for the rest of his life he was a devotee of science, owning several telescopes allowing him to observe the stars and planets, as well as converse knowledgeably regarding them. He was also fascinated by clock mechanisms. His royal palaces featured scores of clocks scattered throughout, and at one time up to 7 ticked away in his royal bedchamber, which to me sounds like a nightmare. I don't know about anyone else, but I cannot stand the sound of a ticking clock while you're trying to sleep. The only thing louder at night than a ticking clock in a hallway, which I discovered much to my peril, waking up my mum when she was on nights, is when I dropped an electric toothbrush into a sink basin. It's the loudest noise I've ever heard. In 1662, Charles granted a royal charter to a group of scientists that had formed 2 years earlier. Charles's grant established the Royal Society. Though Charles never attended a meeting of the society, his members were his frequent guests, and he enjoyed discussing new scientific discoveries and evolving methods in the scientific world. His fascination with clocks, timekeeping, and the stars led him to establish the Royal Observatory in Greenwich in 1675. The original building, now a museum, is the site of 0 degrees of longitude, aka the prime meridian used across the globe when calculating time and distances on Earth. The Observatory and Royal Society together are Charles II's most enduring legacy. And I've been to the Greenwich meridian, it's just a line, it's just a plaque. Because it's like the equator, if anyone's ever been there, it's just a line. And like, you know, like a little tourist trap thing. The difficulties experienced during the reign of Charles II were almost uniformly blamed in one way or another on religious differences. So the Catholics blamed the war on the Protestants, and the Protestants blamed the war on the Catholics. But then you've got the Episcopalians who blame the war on the Presbyterians and the Catholics. And then you have the Protestants who suspect that the Great Fire of London has been started by the Catholics deliberately working for the French, and so on and so forth, until just everybody involved went mad. So religion was a dominant force in politics as well, and Charles attempted to ease the religious tensions with the Royal Declaration of Indulgence in 1672. In the act, he cancelled penalties against Catholics and dissenters that had been enacted by Parliament to support the Church of England. Parliament were none too pleased and forced him to withdraw this the same year. A third Anglo-Dutch war also weakened Charles in the House of Commons, and when it became known that his heir, James, the Duke of York, was a Catholic, movements began in Parliament to alter the succession. Anti-Catholic demonstrations devolved into riots, and throughout Britain, Catholics were denounced, tried in kangaroo courts, and imprisoned, or worse, executed. In 1679, to forego Parliament from trying to minister a subject to anti-Catholic hysteria, Charles dissolved Parliament, which is just a thing the Crown can do. Like, just at any point, they could just dissolve all of Parliament and make a new one. Like, I wrote a script for today, I found out about this, and just the more and more research I did on like the powers that the Queen had, because the Queen was the monarch at the time, was astounding that she could just dissolve Parliament. And if the new Parliament that came up wasn't to their liking, just dissolve it again. And do you know who did that? Charles II, because 4 more parliaments were formed that year and he dissolved them all. In something I think we could all describe as a pretty big mood, Charles II became kind of annoyed with the theatre of politics and just declared himself the absolute monarch. Political enemies and religious opponents often found themselves as residents of the Tower of London. Many of these were executed with the mere pretense of a trial. Others went into exile. Later in his reign, his brother James gained considerable influence in the court, creating further enmity among Catholics and Protestants. Charles's influence on this, though, was limited by virtue of him being dead, and he died following a brief illness on February 6, 1685, likely from the effects of renal disease. He was 54 years of age. Some scholars believe he converted to Catholicism on his deathbed, and others dispute this contention. He did ask his brother James to provide support to his mistresses, and even mentioned Nell Gwyn by name when he uttered, "Let not poor Nelly starve." Apparently, his mistresses weighed more heavily on his mind than his faith, as they had done throughout his life. He was interred in Westminster Abbey in a somewhat subdued funeral for such an extravagant man, attended by relatively few. Suspicion of his conversion to Catholicism is believed to have been the reason for the low attendance, which was held at night on February 14th, St. Valentine's Day. Seemingly, religious controversy followed the man to the grave. So I hope everybody enjoyed this video. I certainly enjoyed making it, and shout outs to script author Larry Holsworth for writing this one. Again, follow them at the social media links below if they provided them. I've been your host, Karl Smallwood. You can find me over at Fact Fiend with Karl Smallwood and Wiki Weekends, where we have an altogether more relaxed style than this, but nonetheless, we try and cover things of a factual nature with a humorous and personal slant. And just, yeah, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like. If you have any comments, in particular about my presentation and hosting style, which I'm hoping has been refined since my first appearance on this channel. And yeah, subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. And also check out the sister channels to Biographics, Geographics, and Top 10s, where I'm also acting as the interim host. And as always, I'd like to wish everybody out there the day that they deserve. Cheers.